Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to continue this series of faculty dialogues with the San Francisco Theological Seminary at the University of Redlands Graduate School of Theology. Today, I'll be talking to Dr. Julius Bailey, who is the Eugene Farlough-California Chair in African American Christianity at San Francisco Theological Seminary and a professor of religious studies at the University of Redlands College of Art and Sciences. Here is a little bit about Dr. Julius. So he's a professor of religious studies at the University of Redlands, having received his BA in religious studies from Occidental College and an MA and PhD in religious studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Go Tar Heels. He teaches courses on varied aspects of religion and has written 3 books: Down in the Valley, An Introduction to African American Religious History, Race Patriotism, Protests and Print Culture in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and Around the Family Altar, Domesticity in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, 1865 to 1900. He's also written a number of articles, book chapters, and encyclopedia entries, and was featured in a course on African mythology entitled The Great Mythologies of the World, Africa, which was produced by the Great Courses DVD series. Julius, I'm so happy that you're here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. I so appreciate you taking time to talk with me today.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much we can dive into related to your expertise. And the first thing that I was really curious about is what roles have traditional African religions played in the formation of American Black churches?
Yeah. And so that's kind of like every topic scholars disagree about everything. And so the question about African religious tensions is one that's ongoing. And so some scholars, again, sort of turns on the role of the Middle Passage. And so whether that trip when people were taken from Africa, placed in chains, brought to America, and those months-long journey, what impact that had on African religious life as it came to America. So some scholars argue that because of that trauma, Africans hung more closely to their religious beliefs, hung on more tightly to them, and so you can see the African religious traditions in the way that African churches in preaching practice and musical styles. For others, they would say that trauma in the Middle Passage was so devastating that much of African religious traditions were lost. And so while African churches are distinctive in their practices, that distinctiveness comes out of the oppression of slavery and speaking to that particular situation once they arrive in America. So there's some debate about, so not much debate about whether it's distinctive or not, but the source of that distinctiveness is debated. And so, at least for me, and thinking about Afro religious traditions, they definitely seem to be informed by the ways that the preaching styles seem to be persuasive. You look at the ways, again, African religious traditions are very diverse. It's a continent. And so, but generally speaking, if you go to African religious traditions, traditional African traditional religions, you often see some similarities in African churches. And I think that's most apparent really during the Great Awakenings when initial early Christian white missionaries trying to do outreach to Black enslaved Africans really had a hard time with the Anglican Church started early with the Society for Propagation of the Gospel in 1701 and just didn't have a lot of success because mostly based on sort of deliberative, kind of sit in a classroom, think about these religious concepts, and gradually over time you become sort of a Christian. While the Great Awakenings, when it was much more spontaneous, there's passionate sermons and there's music and there's movement, many more Africans converted to Christianity. So some could say that particular version of Christianity had a more attractive to enslaved Africans. And so that's when Christianity, at least Black Christian forms, really seem to take off. So it seems like while there's some debate about the exact source of it, there does seem to be something in that expressive practice. Again, not for every African American, there's diversity, but for many African Americans in the 17th, 18th century, that more expressive worship, plain speaking style where everyone can understand it, whether if you're a farmer or a theologian, we should all understand that message. That seemed to resonate most closely with early African American Christians in America. And so I would say that had a huge impact on their attractiveness of Christianity to enslaved Africans, at least in early America.
Got it. So I what I'm hearing you say is that there's this sort of debate between nature and nurture. Was there this sort of inherent religiosity that was explicitly carried over, or was there a general disposition maybe to a more integrated and heart-centered approach to religion and spiritual practice that ends up resonating with American Great Awakening religion?
Oh.
Yeah, interesting. And so, and it's interesting you're saying that the conversion of enslaved Africans was more prevalent during the Great Awakening, and that actually raises another question that I think that I and maybe many of my viewers might just be historically ignorant of, which is, I guess my assumption was that enslaved Africans were indoctrinated into Christianity by default the moment they were brought over in the Middle Passage, and that they are, that the masters, the slave masters were forcing them, had some compulsory church attendance, and that was, in some ways assimilated, but in some ways, rejected and made their own in hush harbors and other spaces where, there was a more organic incubation of faith. Is that accurate, or am I mistaken?
No, I think there's definitely that piece is there for sure. I think there's lots so many historical tensions, and so one of the rationales for the slave trade as it gets established in America is that the Africans would have died heathens in Africa. They would never been exposed to Christianity in America and in Africa without the slave trade, which again is problematic because Christianity's been in Africa for centuries. But that sort of so it comes as a very different model of the usually the missionaries go to the place of the people. Here they go and bring the Africans to America. And so, as you said, you would think, wow, they must be throwing Christianity left and right, and let's get them indoctrinated. But at least for many of the masters, there's really tension. That's sort of these questions about what impact what Christianity have on the slaves. And there was a wide perception that if you Christianize your slaves, they're going to become rebellious, which again is kind of interesting. Sort of idea of, so what's striking, at least for these early missionaries, particularly the Anglican Church, is they almost have to make a case for Christianity as a means of pacifying slaves. Like, no, it's not. If you Christianize your slaves, they're going to be even better slaves. They're not going to rebel because they're going to not only obey you, they're going to want to obey you because they want to obey their God. And so it's really early on this question of sort of this really passive view, Christianity as a means of slave control, kind of piece to it. And so it's sort of striking that on one hand there's this this narrative of enslaved, or you want to Christianize slaves, but then even early on there's laws against baptism or placing, so that when they begin, before in many Christian traditions you baptized, that means you're a full member of the Christian society. But here early on, 1706 and other different colonial legislatures begin to have these laws passed that have to have slaves declare that you're choosing baptism for the good of your soul and in no way trying to change your condition of slavery. And so it's like, whoa, what's going on here? Usually it's this, so this ritual that's meant to empower and freedom and inclusion becomes, all the power of it seems to be taken away, that asking slaves to be baptized, but it's not going to have any impact on your everyday life. You're still going to be doing all the work 6 days a week. You have 1 day to work for your own sustenance. And that's also the day, that Sunday is also the day you're supposed to go to church. And so part of your day to take care of yourself, you have to also give over in terms of this religious dynamic. And so it's a tricky one. And so it's for sure there's some there's language towards the importance of Christianizing slaves, but it seems like there's really a lot of concern. And so what that Christianity is going to look like seems like it's very different than what white Christians are thinking about at the time, that it's a Christianity that's not supposed to have any impact on your everyday life. And so I think that's another reason why early on that's not a very attractive option for enslaved Africans. A religion that doesn't get baptized and nothing's going to change, that doesn't seem like a very attractive religious ritual potentially.
Absolutely. Wow. Thank you for shining light on that aspect of it. So it sounds like the white folks in the equation inherently knew there was some potentially liberationist power in bringing someone into the church, into Christianity as a baptized member, that there would be some implied shared humanity there that they were uncomfortable with. And then other white Christians were arguing, yeah, but actually, this stuff has been used to pacify the masses for millennia. Like, we can actually make them more compliant. And I think that that's a nuance that often both religious and irreligious people miss, is that our faith traditions contain these seeds of liberation and even insurrection, and also this way of being sort of the chaplains of the state, and ways of just being, continuing to comply. And so I'm wondering if you could speak more to this. Like, how do you see, maybe up to including the Great Awakening, how do you see the Black church in America as having been influenced by white settler colonial Christianity? And to what degree do you see Black American Christianity as this emancipatory, decolonial alternative?
Yeah, and again, I feel like every question I go, this could be this or it could be that. But yeah, it's a tricky one because for many African Americans, their first introduction to Christianity are through white missionaries who reached out to them, and either as slaves or as freed people. And so there's definitely this influence. And so Richard Allen, who founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church, in his autobiography says, I'm loyal to the Methodists because they were the first ones who came to me. They gave me the gospel message in a way that I could understand. And so they cared about me, they cared about my soul. And so there's a real dedication to that denomination, which again is what I'm interested in as in my own research. But I think sometimes there's kind of this generalized Black Christianity. But at least early on, Richard Allen was definitely a Christian, but he was a Methodist, so that was his identity. And so I think there is a way that that there's an importance, there's a context. They're drawn to Christianity. They're introduced by white Christians, but there's also that liberation piece that you mentioned is also there. And so when Richard Allen is has this, in this interracial congregation, there's segregated seating, which again, some people are surprised about. Wait a minute, yes, there's segregation in America, but there is segregated seating in Philadelphia, in this Methodist, St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church. There's segregation, lots of discrimination. Often Black congregants had to wait to take communion till all the white members had done it. There's instances of white pastors being hesitant or wouldn't hold Black babies to baptize them. There's separate cemeteries when you die. So there's a Black cemetery and a white cemetery. So there's lots that African Americans are drawn to Christianity, are excited about it. But lots of the things in secular society, lots of the discriminatory practices there also took place in the church. And so while there's this origin story and this excitement and gratitude towards white people introducing Christianity to them, there's also this troubling history of discrimination in churches. And so taking that, Richard Allen eventually starts his own church. Well, there's the famous story, at least in my circles, is that the segregated section for Black churches was under construction one Sunday in 1787. This place where Black Christians normally sat, they couldn't sit there. So there was some confusion about that morning in church, where should they sit? So they started trying to figure out where to go. And then the service started, the minister started to pray. And so the Black Christians, being obedient, knelt where they were. The prayer started, you got to kneel. It's a respectful thing. But as they were kneeling, the white ushers came and started pulling them off their knees because they're still in the white section. And so they're pulling them off, so you got to go, you can't do it. And so they go, and they say, wait, just let us finish praying and then we'll move to wherever you want us to go. And they're like, no, you have to go now. And so eventually prayer is over, and Richard Allen, again, he famously says, we left the church that morning and they were no more troubled with us in the church. And so that's when they start their own churches. And there's similar stories throughout Black church history of that kind of practice, and African American just going, there's like a tipping point. I just can't do it anymore. We sat in this place, we did everything, and now here we are trying to pray, and you won't even, isn't prayer important? Is that something that we're supposed to do? And you won't even let us do that because the racial stuff is taking precedent over seemingly religious community. And so on the one hand, there is this, I think there's definitely and when Richard Allen forms his own church, he calls it the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So he doesn't just call it the African church or something. He still sees himself as a Methodist Episcopal. So he has that connection to the past, but he also has a very different vision about what it looks like to be a Christian and how African Americans should be treated. So on the one hand, there's that legacy of the origins. And I think out of that, there is some a liberation theology, a very different view of what Christianity looks like. So I think it's another one that's kind of both and kind of answers to your question.
Sure. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. That the ways in which white Christians failed to live up to these sort of salvific, emancipatory, liberationist ideals, and of course the Black Christians in those communities were facing the brunt of that discrimination. So why wouldn't they seek to create a more place where they can belong? That makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense. And so there are these inspiring origins, and in so many ways, inspiring continuing actions and legacies in the world. And yet, in this day and age, there are a lot of people of all races who are growing disenchanted with organized religion, institutional religion, and facing more choice in what to do with our time than ever before, on the one hand, and in some ways, less choice in what to do with our time because of exploitative capitalism, working ourselves to death. A lot of folks are leaving churches in droves. And so if someone's tuning in who maybe they grew up in a certain stream, in a certain context of American Black Christianity, and they left their particular church, what do you wish they knew about the diversity that's present in present day Black expressions of Christianity?
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's kind of a popular culture image of Black churches. Like almost every movie you watch, there's like the charismatic preacher up front with some message, and then the choir will be singing some emotional song, and someone usually come forward. And so, yeah, there's definitely a part of that in Black churches for sure, but clearly a kind of stereotype of. And so there's some truth there. There's some churches that are very much like that and do those sorts of things. But there's such a diverse African American community, and there's so much diversity in Black church traditions as well. So there are Pentecostal traditions that have the more Holy Spirit based. The service goes as long as the Holy Spirit wants you to go. There's and then again I just say AME church, and then there's sort of what people call high church or whatever, kind of more cerebral. I kind of hesitate to use that term because like that tension between enthusiastic worship and kind of more formal worship, I guess I'll say it that way. And so it can be a tricky one because at the core, some people say, well, what's Black religion is enthusiastic and this is what you do. And so there's oftentimes tricky to find a place for traditions that don't adhere to that stereotype. So, AME church or other churches where the service is more formal. And so there's that. There's a long history of Black Catholicism and so oftentimes when people talk about Black church traditions, they'll kind of equate that with Christianity with Protestantism. And so I think it's always important to say, wait a minute, there's Black Catholics too. And so make sure that we're expanding that category as well. And so I think there's plenty for people to choose from. And I think it's, like you said, it's a tricky one because post COVID, there's challenges that once you sort of get used to, consuming is the right word, but or going to church at home, it can be challenging to leave that and go into in-person stuff. And so I would say, yeah, there's diversity and with throughout Black traditions. And so whatever you're looking for, there's some that are more, let's see, doctrine based is more sort of called spiritual. Churches that meet, in formal, huge sanctuaries, or storefront churches. And so there's such a just a diversity in all religious traditions. I think it's important to acknowledge essential components of the Black church tradition, but also, as your question suggests, that there's also a wide range and it's always changing. So it's like, what version of Black church traditions are you talking about? Like 5 minutes ago, there's probably a new church started, a new way of seeing the world. So I think there's definitely something for everyone if you're interested in that history and tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. And the question of, how people are doing church in a post-COVID world deserves its own question. We'll get to that in a moment.
Yeah.
But I'm also wondering, something that I noticed in the exodus of younger people from institutional church, and it seems to be a transracial phenomenon now, is also concern around, certain social issues and ecological issues. So, whether it's climate change or LGBTQ inclusion. And so I'm wondering, in your assessment of the current landscape of Black Christianities, plural, are there spaces within Black congregations where they are addressing not only the historic and important emancipatory issues around, racial equity and justice, but queer inclusion and environmental concern?
Yeah, I think there's definitely again there's diversity. I think there's definitely space. I think then in some traditions, ministers can be pastors and be a part of various communities. Um, that and there's spaces for that and openness to having congregants come. And so I think even the question of the term black church has been something that's been used historically, black church, but even there's kind of an openness now to saying, we're a church for everyone. And so kind of acknowledging that history, but we're kind of pushing back or moving away from that term. We're not really a black church or using that formally. So it's generally conclusive for races, ethnicities, I think sexualities. I think there's definitely there's openness to there, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that there's a history in many black churches of really being resistant to that kind of stuff and being pretty conservative in terms of what it means to, be married, the place of gay people in the church, that sort of thing. And so again, I think there's sometimes, and again, there's many churches that are liberal and are open to those kind of progressive, having those kind of ideas. But I think it's true that there is still some there. It's still resistant. So even like I studied AME church history, and so they had their first female bishop in the year 2000, and it's like, okay, that's probably, but it's like, wow, that's it's so again, yeah, not to, and again, there's diversity and the women can lead to many other traditions and openness. But I think as just there's diversity about the openness. There's also a history of a tradition of certain interpretations of the Bible. I guess I would say that as well.
For sure. And in a moment, I want to return to that question of, if folks are moving away from the understanding of it as a black church and more of a church for all people. But before we go there, I want to switch up the question a little bit and say, for those of us who aren't intimately familiar with historically black churches, i.e., white folks, what do you wish we knew about her spiritual expressions, cultures, and impacts on American history and culture in general?
Yeah. Well, lots for sure. And I think even just the presence of African Americans in America just raises all kinds of questions that I don't think otherwise would have been. So that America based on freedom and those kind of headline freedom and religious expression, well, what do those things mean for people who are enslaved? And so Frederick Douglass has this famous, was the 4th of July to the slave? And so it's a tricky one because on the one hand, it's there's these themes of religious freedom. So I think really the presence of African Americans and African American churches really raises questions. And so even with the early example I gave of segregation in white churches, it's like, or mixed churches, it's like, well, what is it? You wouldn't even raise that question if it was just sort of totally separate. And so the presence of African Americans, I think, have really forced certain religious questions and forced question of segregation. How do you treat people? What's the issues of social justice has been really important. I think it's sort of even just the presence of black churches and in America has raised these kind of questions. And so I think, and for black churches, given this sort of segregation and awful hostile environment of America, black churches have just been so important to African Americans. There's just very few spaces that were available for African Americans to meet without there being some sort of ramifications for it, or being locked up or something. And so all these laws against, more than 5 African Americans meeting together, or in the 19th century, or you can't meet after sundown. And so one of the few places that you could meet were black churches. And so that's where you sort of get these incubators of leaders. Where do people learn to speak well in public and become black politicians? Well, they're often ministers, because every Sunday they're speaking to a crowd. And so I think there's a way that just the presence of African Americans has been important. And I think sometimes culture goes this. I mentioned earlier about African religious retentions, and sometimes framed as the survival of African culture. But I think also important to note the ways that black cultures have influenced white culture. It's not just sort of survival of black churches and cultures. African Americans have influenced the ways that white Americans eat, how they worship styles, even the Great Awakenings. It's like the presence of Africans that have this more expressive religious practice. That's when the Great Awakenings happened. So I think it's sort of understudied the ways that the presence of Africans may have influenced this sort of shift in the way that people are thinking about Christianity. So that the civil rights movement, the way the black churches raising these questions, Martin Luther King Jr. and others, pressing these issues into the public consciousness. And I think the framework for social justice, I think it really has changed over time because of Black churches having to press it. If the presence of oppression makes people have to address this question. And so, are you going to keep having slavery in America? Are you going to still segregating? How does that fit with some of the promises that America has made about what it means to be an American and to be free? So I think there's lots of examples, but I think that just the presence of Black churches has sort of forced the public conversation to go particular ways in America.
That makes a lot of sense. And even though these, historically Black churches have been separate in terms of constituency necessarily because of persecution, because of being treated as less than, there is nonetheless this sort of pervasive influence, even in white culture, white, perceptions, and, even what you're describing is the film tropes and things like that, Sister Act, etc. Like there's all these, different archetypes and stereotypes, but also, undeniable history of social change and social movements that also ignited the imaginations of, sympathetic white folks to partner together. Um, but let's talk about that partnership a little bit, because you're talking about how, in this new era, folks are like, hey, we want to be inclusive of all races. And I grew up earlier in my life as an evangelical Christian, and evangelical Christians were really big about, supposed integration in various levels. And oftentimes in the sort of Baptist and Pentecostal and PCA conservative Presbyterian churches I grew up in, it was very tokenizing. Like white folks patted themselves on the back if there were one or two Black families in the congregation. It was like, cool, obviously they can come if they, want to. It ended up taking on this unintentionally, but sort of a paternalistic vibe. Um, but I also know that there are evangelical megachurches in particular that sometimes have a higher degree of success at a seeming racial integration. And there have been, understandable critiques levied against some of these congregations, but the idea was like, hey, we are this sort of melting pot ideal, which is, one of the archetypes of American inclusion that's been, put forward in our culture. But I'll never forget when a friend of mine who is a Black Christian, Melvin Bray, told me, he's like, whenever white folks talk about racial reconciliation, especially on a congregational level, tell me when we've had conciliation before you start talking about reconciliation, as though there was this time when we had equal authority, our giftedness was recognized, our humanity was recognized, we were in, leadership positions, etc., as opposed to it being seen as like a favor granted. And so I'm wondering, and what you're aware of these, sort of Black congregations coming of age and wishing to be more inclusive, does it address some of those kinds of concerns, and how does it take shape? How might it be different than how white churches have done it badly? So I'm wondering.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, that's great. And we're thinking specifically in terms of like mega churches, or
I mean, congregations of any size. I
okay.
feel like it's mostly been mega churches and actually Catholic churches that I'm aware of that have some genuine diverse representation on a congregational level. Although oftentimes, at least in the evangelical cases, even those tend to still have the white folks in charge. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering how you see it playing on the ground differently with the roles being reversed in these more historically Black congregational contexts.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm just trying to think. Again, just from my own experience to it, is that it does seem like at least for me, that I'm not sure if the discussion is the same way. I guess I don't see a lot of the ways. I think more kind of empowering all people. So I think it's there. I think there's that sentiment there of reconciliation and we need to be together. But I've never heard it actually explicitly stated that way in the Black. So it's more like we're all. So I think, again, just my own experience, that there's almost sort of assumed that the Black end of things, that you're welcome, you're here, we're together. And so I guess I've never, again, it's only my limited experience. I guess but when I've attended white churches, it's been much more explicit about, usually the white leaders or white people reaching out and we need to do this thing. But I haven't seen it the other way. I guess I haven't seen it be let's address this racial issue. It's at least for me, it's assumed a kind of inclusion, at least in the churches I've attended. That we, that racial change, social justice needs to happen. We do this together, and we can be in this together, and let's do this. But never really like, well, you need to do the X, Y, and Z before you can do that. It's more, let's just do it. I mean, we're all children of God. We're all here together. We're all forgiven. We're all sinful. Let's do this. And so I guess I haven't heard it framed in the same way that I've heard it in white church. Has been much more that have, with multiracial, or as much as they can be multiracial congregations. That's been, I've seen that be much more like, let's reconcile and have that. But I haven't has seen Black churches go, we need to reach out to other races or something. It's like, no, we're welcome and you're welcome to come. But I guess I haven't heard it explicitly expressed that same way, I guess.
Sure. Well, and that strikes me as a very understandable budgeting of energy to not be, overly reaching out. And I'm wondering, again, just speaking from my experience, I don't see white folks being as willing to enter into a predominantly Black congregation and be under predominantly Black leadership. So in these congregations, in your experience, who are at least implicitly being more inclusive, are white folks taking them up on that offer to be part of these faith communities?
And again, I don't know the national trends, and so I don't have any data on that. So I'm just totally anecdotal from my own. But I haven't, the church. I mean, there's been a few, but I haven't seen like half and half, or just. And so, and I don't know, or sometimes, well, sometimes people like pop in for a visit, like let's experience the Black church thing or something,
Sure.
and then kind of go again, not in a negative way, but
Yeah.
just kind of.
Yeah.
But in terms of
Cultural
like
experience.
consistent, regular attendance can be
Mhm.
tricky. So I haven't seen. I've heard lots of people talk about multiracial congregations and everyone, and lots of congregations being inviting for sure, inviting and making that a priority. I guess I haven't ever really experienced it firsthand. Seeing usually it's tipped one way or the other, either almost all white or all Black with a handful of others.
Right.
But again, that's my limited experience.
Sure, sure. Well, what wasn't it Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that the most segregated hour in America is, 11 on a Sunday morning. I think there's, potentially a lot of work to be done in that area. And in my opinion, the lion's share of that ought to be done by those of us who have historically excluded and been oppressive. And it makes perfect sense to me that folks get together in ways that feel safe and generative, as opposed to, continually putting one's neck out on the line for a space that might not actually be welcoming. So it strikes me as a gospel promise and standard, and one that, I guess that a lot of folks are still leaning into.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and let's talk about how the last few years have impacted church participation and even what we consider to be church for any of us, with the COVID-19 pandemic, the switch to virtual congregations, the different understandings of what constitutes safety in congregational levels, which I observed going down in white congregational contexts, largely down partisan political lines. But I'm curious, given how the pandemic has, by and large, throughout its various mutations, disproportionately affected people of color and communities. How has COVID uniquely impacted Black church shapes and trends? And are there historical precedents for other pandemics within particularly Black church history that you might be able to illuminate for us?
Yeah, for sure. And again, lots of diverse, you described diversity in many white traditions, similar for Black tradition, took differing stances in terms of, like I said, safety and masking and vaccinations. And so all the diversity in the sort of public discourse, secular public discourse, I think also took place within many Black church traditions. But I think and again, lots of things I don't think are necessarily unique to Black churches, but really the challenge, I sort of alluded to it earlier, just the challenges is that once you sort of, as you said, go distance learning or distance uh, worshiping and going to church from home, I think now as there's this transition back, I think lots of the talk, at least again in my particular circles, was that God's with you at home. And so it'd be wonderful to be able to go to church, but God is with you there. And we can do what we do at church at home. You're not losing anything. You're just going to have this, the community is moving online. And so all the things that you would have had in person, God's going to be with you at home as well. And so, which was great. And I think it really encouraged people and was a great message for people who felt disconnected and maybe depressed, or all the range of emotions that people had during, as we're in the pandemic. But I think now the challenge is, well, how do you get people to come back once you've had that? You've said, God's with me at home. You've already told me that. You told me I could do everything from home. So now why should I? I mean, I could give money from home. I could tithe from home. I could just click the button. I can do, I can do the worship stuff. We can have these prayer groups at home. We can have Bible study. And so all the things that normally would bring people in person, they did the best they could to replicate it online. And so, again, I'm not sure how wide the trend is, but at least again, the circles I'm in, it's a real challenge to get people to come back and to be in person. And maybe it varies, just like others, like in-person schooling or in-person things, that they miss that community. For others who don't want to drive far to church, or don't want to, don't want to get dressed, whatever sort of practical things, I think it's a real challenge. And I think, and even like I said earlier, what it means to be a church. Traditionally, it's been a physical space. That's what a church is. You go to that place. I think even the IRS has that as one of their standards, that you have a physical location. But so now it's like, maybe now we're even going to start thinking about what it means to have a church. Will they start rethinking? Can you have a virtual community where you're doing all the things and be sanctioned as a religious organization in America? Or if there'll be this return to, no, if you want to be a church is a physical location. And so you need to come in person. So I'm curious how the message might shift, instead of how do you tell people, how do you describe to people the importance of being in person after telling them how you could do those same things, from home?
Yeah, wow, those are such good questions. As someone who is, both an early adopter of technology, I tend to be, but also someone that manages my raging ADHD, and noting the very harmful effects that, increased screen time can have on my own, sort of social, and I say even spiritual development. I feel like, I personally am of two minds of that. Like, and having a child with special needs, I'm tuned into conversations around disability and spirituality, and also aging and spirituality. And I've heard from so many folks who live with who are disabled or who are older, that they want the increased accessibility of virtual church to continue, even if a majority of a congregation moves in person. And to me, that makes so much sense. At the same time, especially under sort of backbreaking capitalism, I think there's something subversive about getting together face to face and in person, in ways that sort of kinesthetic element of community can be so important. So I'm curious, as you maybe blur your lines between historian and human being who is an active participant with definite opinions, like what do you think the aspirational future of post COVID church should be?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I guess for me, it would be, I guess for me, it's whatever they want it to be. And so I'm interested in,
Mhm.
I'm interested to watch and see how people do it. I'm not necessarily, like you said, there's tension. I think there's a power in meeting together. I don't think there's any, there's biblical passages that talk about it, that, when people meet together, there's something special that happens, and maybe that can happen distance learning, but I think, the power of it. And so, but I do wonder, like you said earlier, that on-demand mentality, we want to watch that show. We want to binge watch the show. We want to order our stuff and have it delivered today or tomorrow. And so I wonder if that's the way it will be, if that people, they don't want their religion at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. They want their religion when they want their religion. And so, I don't know. I guess my speculation is that might be the way it goes, but especially with this younger, I teach, he's 18. I don't know. I should have asked them about what they think, but my sense is, I don't know if, not to, it's easy to take, shots at your younger generation, but just, with TikTok and other things, just the attention span, I don't know. And I'm guilty too. So I'm like, my attention span is short as well, but I don't know if people can sit through an hour sermon anymore, or even if you make it the most engaging thing and you do the songs and the movable podium, all the stuff that I think, mega church, I think, have done really well. Just make it contemporary, get rid of pews, make it a very kind of non-church experience in some ways, traditional church experience.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering what it will look like in the future. And so my guess is it will. My guess it'll probably have to change, or I don't know how you. And I think historically, I think churches just have to make decisions about what's negotiable and what's essential. And so
Mhm.
if you, because it seems like over time, like black churches, other churches, well, you have to kind of adapt over time, or you're just going to die. So you're just, especially those next generations, the people that bought into whatever the message was one generation, it seems like people, the next generation is almost wired to disagree with it. So,
Right.
and so you have to have a different, or these leaders that people love, they're just like, well, they're an old person. I don't know, I don't get them anymore or something. And so I think there's a way that there's an adaptation that has to take place. And so I think churches will have to decide what is the core of who we are and what is the change that we think we need to make in order to be relevant in today's environment, and to be able to do that in a way that doesn't compromise who you are. And I think that'll look differently depending on the community, because once you start changing stuff, you just want to be like the world or whatever. Over time you change too much, and it's like, why are you even meeting together? There's nothing distinctive about you, so why should I even come if we're going to be exactly like the outside world? But if you're too disconnected from the outside world, it's like, are you even relevant? Like you're doing whatever, Facebook or something. I don't know, whatever it is, right? You're not relevant anymore. And so how do you navigate that? And so I guess that for me, that would be one question. And I think I guess I missed you earlier. You asked about other pandemics. And so I did want to plug, I do have a talk coming up on, I'm doing a thing on the yellow fever epidemic. And
Mm.
so in the 19th century, and so in speaking with ministers about our current pandemic, I got curious. And so I do research on AME church history, African Methodist Episcopal Church history, and started looking at different epidemics, looking at cholera and smallpox and yellow fever. And so I was struck by the yellow fever epidemic as, and sort of comparing that to the present, because it had all similar dynamics. Yellow fever, really troubling. The symptoms are really clear. Your skin's yellowed and whites of your eyes become yellowed. While today, you may or may not know who has COVID, but the similar dynamic of panic, quarantine, people being locked up, not having access to businesses, having issues, and people and church members and other religious organizations helping those who stayed. So there's a long history of that. So I didn't want to just acknowledge that. Could you raise that earlier?
Beautiful. And for those of us who are not blessed to be in the Bay Area when you're giving this talk, do you happen to know, speaking of online communications, if this will also be streamed or archived online?
Yeah, I guess it'll be streamed and hopefully recorded, and so
Beautiful.
hopefully people will be able to listen to that. I found it really interesting. Just do it again. Of course, I'm researching, so of course I think it's interesting, but
Mhm.
just a lot of that I just struck that there's like, it's like I look New Orleans, Memphis, Jacksonville, all these different in 1878, looking at the reactions, and the
Wow.
pattern's almost always the same. It's there's a report of somebody having yellow fever. People freak out. The people who have the means immediately leave those towns. Quarantine, government puts a quarantine in place for those who are left, and they're just kind of struggling and trying to figure out, what do you do now? I
Wow.
can't work. They're not letting any products in because they've done this quarantine. And so, is there going to be a vaccine? How are we going to get out of this? And what does church life look like in the midst of that context? I feel like all kind of parallels to today, so I find that really interesting. So yeah, if it's on Tuesday, October 18th at 10 o'clock Pacific time, and it'll be streamed and recorded, hopefully, so it'll be available hopefully on the university website.
Beautiful. We'll be sure to release this in advance of that and include information on how to access that in the notes, because I know that we'll want to tune in. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm interested to, like, one of your areas of expertise is also new religious movements outside of Christianity, or at least Christianity is conventionally understood. And I feel like that's, another maybe lazy stereotype that persists about the Black experience in America as well. Most Black folks are either, Christians or lapsed Christians. Or if you're slightly more religiously literate, then you'll realize that, a number of Black folks are Muslim in one flavor or another. But you have, familiarity with a variety of, what in the past were derisively called cults and what are now more accurately described as new religious movements. And so I'm wondering how, whether it's a more established religious stream with, with Black constituency, like say Buddhism, Or new religious movements like the Nation of Islam or the Five Percenters or the United Nubian Nation of Moors. Like, how have these kind of groups influenced the overall Black experience in America, and have they influenced Black Christianities in particular?
Yeah, for sure. And I should have noted earlier that there were clearly Black Muslims as well in the slave trade. And there's early accounts of people describing people with prayer rugs and, praying towards Mecca. And so a history of Black Muslims as well in that early history. When in the 19th century, lots of Black new religious movements emerged, particularly after the Great Migration. So that in the early 20th century, 1910, 1920s, many African Americans left the South, terrible conditions, economic conditions, lots of racial violence, just lots of terrible things happening. And so many African Americans left, and sometimes they went from rural communities to larger urban cities locally, and sometimes they moved from, Georgia and South Carolina and moved to places like Chicago and Detroit and New York, and so in LA as well, just kind of moving out of that area. And so with that relocation, many people had questions, and they would go to Black churches, and for some just didn't feel the connection. Either they were more formal in the way that I mentioned earlier and were used to kind of a more enthusiastic, I'll put it that way, enthusiastic worship style, and found Black churches from their own description to be kind of cold. Like, what's going on there? And then they came to the North with these promises of it's going to be a better life, and there's all this racial hostility in the South, but you come to the North, it's the promised land. You get a great job. There's no segregation. It's going to be amazing. Great housing. It's going to be awesome. But as people arrived, they experienced that nothing really changed. It was a different context, but there's still racial discrimination in Boston and in Chicago. And so still hard time finding jobs, still racial segregation in terms of housing. And so all this stuff they thought was going to be changed didn't really come to fruition. And so again, the historical narrative is that this huge population, and we're talking about millions of people relocating. And so this real disconnection, they go to Black churches, they don't find a fit, and they're looking for different answers. And so some have said that the Nation of Islam, Black Judaism emerges during this time, the Moorish Science Temple, all these different Black communities, and they all have they're very distinctive, but they all have very similar messages in the sense of who are you really? And these white churches, white America is telling you you're inferior, you're less intelligent, all this sort of negative stuff. To hate your skin color, it's negative. And these movements emerge and say, no, don't be ashamed of your Black skin. Don't be ashamed of your history. They're telling your history of slavery. And so the Moorish Science Temple will say, no, your history has these great, amazing Asian and African empires. You're descended from kings and queens, and they're telling you that you're a slave or you're a second-class citizen. And so in the Nation of Islam, similarly, they're saying you're lesser than. They're saying, no, you're the original tribe of Shabazz. You are the superior people. You're not inferior. You're actually superior to white people, and white people are the devils. God made them as punishment. And so again, which is really, striking and terrible to say, but it's also striking that people could hear white people are the devil, and then look at the way that white people treated people in America and go, maybe they're devils.
Maybe you're onto something, yeah.
So that message, and so these groups answer that question of who are you really, and it's a really empowering message because it's you don't need to straighten your hair, you don't need to get these whiteners to whiten your skin. Who taught you to hate your skin? Who taught you that? White people taught you that. That's who taught you to hate each other, to not connect with each other, to be suspicious of other Black people. White people taught you that. And so it's a really powerful message. And so Malcolm X describes it all about autobiography as he's part of the Nation of Islam of fishing practices. So he'd be outside of Black churches and go, what'd your white Jesus do for you today? Because they would often have a picture of white Jesus. White Jesus is on their walls in Black churches. And for the Nation of Islam, they say, what does that do to you psychologically if you don't envision your God looking like yourself? You're praying to a white God. What does that do to your soul? What does that do to your psychology to do that? And so these movements really emerge, I think, as in some ways their own tradition for sure, as an alternative to the message that many white churches are given Black churches, and even Black churches. What are you doing there? What are you doing for us today? How are you improving our condition today? So you really can make a case that the Nation of Islam and others really pushed Black churches to ask these questions.
Mm.
And so Martin Luther King Jr. comes out of that movement of what are you going to do? What this sort of, again, for some people, a passive view of the world, that you don't just do it to be a Christian and to go to heaven. What about today? What about my life today? And so I think there's a way that these Black new religious movements like the Nation of Islam and Black churches are really in dialogue and in competition in many ways too. Just there's Black, you want people to come to your church or your tradition. And so there's that literal competition. Yeah. But even I think they're kind of push each other to see, what does it look like to do social justice in America? How do you remain relevant in America? And I think you see that with Martin Luther King Jr., he's pushing for social justice, civil rights movement, his I Have a Dream speech, but there's a real tendency to leave Martin Luther King Jr., with the I Have a Dream speech, but he lived for years after that. Yeah. As he starts criticizing Vietnam, he says that I think my dream has become a nightmare. And so people don't talk about that part. And I think it's because that doing that kind of work is exhausting, and he was getting discouraged, but people want to keep Martin Luther King Jr. on that I Have a Dream state. And I think similarly with Malcolm X, that by any means necessary is definitely true. And he's pushing and, pushing for, and for his perspective, you don't ask people for freedom, you take it. I'm not gonna ask people who are pressing me to suddenly just be nice to me or something. That's not how you do it. You demand it, or just give us our own nation, because why is it assumed that white churches, that white schools, that white banks, whatever it is, why is it assumed that white is always better? Yep. Why can't Black teachers could be better than these white teachers, that we can care for ourselves better than they can care for us? And so I think there's a way that message is powerful. And then once Malcolm X goes to Mecca and has that change, that rethinking of seeing the world, he becomes more inclusive, inviting white people to be part of his new organization. So you really see this shift in perspective. You can make a case that Martin Luther King Jr. gets more radical over time, and Malcolm X actually becomes more kind of mainstream over time. And so I think there's a way that these new movements can really, really push Black churches push those communities, and really the Black new religious movements really offered an alternative for African Americans. They answered questions that it seems like Black churches weren't satisfactorily answering. And so who are you as a Black person? Yeah. Which I think is amazing too, that you even have to ask that question. African America's been America 300 years, or still, well, who are we? And it's the question, but we're not who they say we are. And we have this history. It's a secret history. The white people don't want to, again, for many of the Black new religious movements, it's a secret history. If the white people have hidden it from you, because if you knew your own history, they know you'd come for them. You would live up to your full potential. They know you have this glorious future. And so they hid this history from you. And so I think there's a real power there. And you see that over and over again with these groups. And there's a message that resonated with Black Americans, at least in that particular moment, that Black churches didn't seem to address.
Yeah, wow, that's a powerful aspect to highlight there. That, there's questions of who are you, that in these Black new religious movements takes on archetypal and cosmic, sometimes extraterrestrial, certainly divine meaning of, hey, who are we really? And it really helps refine my understanding of new religious movements that are in a lot of ways like the research and development wing of humanity. Like, it's a smaller group of people who are super intense, super not mainstream, who are trying out a particular idea or concept with their whole being. And oftentimes those movements are fraught with drama, infighting, sometimes even, things that we would consider to be highly unethical in some cases. But nonetheless, they typically advance something that's a germ of change for a larger, culture or conversation. And that makes a lot of sense, how that dialogue may have, moved and catalyzed the Black church more to be like, why are we praying to white Jesus? Hold up.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's and it's even striking too, again, the diversity of Black communities, that for many Black churches, they would say that they're a cult, right? They do that kind of like these, or I don't know if they necessarily use that word, but they would say they're problematic. These groups are radical, be using some of the same language that many mainstream white churches would be using as well. And so there's that that marginalization that happens in Black communities too, that you're not really, so even like the Nation of Islam, you're not really Muslim or whatever, those kinds of issues is striking, because you have Black religious communities also marginalizing other Black communities as well, saying you're not really, you're problematic, or you're not not real religions or whatever.
Well, Thank you. As we're bringing this into a close, I'm wondering if there's anything that you're researching right now that's like really exciting for you.
Yeah, I guess I sort of pointed towards it with the yellow fever stuff. I've just been, or in the 19th century, just really struck by looking at epidemics. I think the tendency to kind of look at our present situation and go, "This is the first time we faced it. It's so unique and it's so different." And so it's been real striking to me to just see that the panic, the struggles of quarantine, questioning whether the government is for you or against you, should you take a vaccine or not. How helpful quarantine is, how to social distance, and what it looks like to be religious in these contexts. What it looks like to be faithful in these contexts, I think has just been really striking to me to see that it's a different form and different context, but that people have gone through pandemics and epidemics before and have really struggled with a lot of things that we're struggling with without all the tools of you can just hop on your computer and do stuff. You're just sort of at home, and just kind of the fear of how do you protect yourself, how do you care for people. And I think for me has been struck by the ministers who I may have mentioned it earlier. Usually there'd be an outbreak of yellow fever, panic, and the people with the means would leave. And so many religious people, particularly in Black churches as well, would stay and care for people in spaces that had been historically excluded for them. So like white homes, and so white people would have Black people come and care for them. And so it's striking to me that during pandemics, that when there's a need, some of this racial discrimination and boundaries can be, we'll ease that up now because it's a crisis. But then once the crisis is done, everything kind of goes back into place. And so I'm curious now if that will be not that I have an idea of what's going to happen, but that some of these places we're all in this together, when you help each other, if that kind of momentum can be sustained once people declare a pandemic over, or if you just kind of just go back to your equilibrium, normal stuff, and all the things that sort of were gained maybe during that in this really troubling time, if we'll kind of just go back to the status quo.
Yeah. Can we learn those lessons? And that sort of cliche of those who don't learn from history are destined to repeat it. I'm wondering, if last question, like if someone is a mid-career professional, or maybe a recent graduate from undergrad school, or maybe they're a minister and they're looking to go deeper. How does an education at San Francisco Theological Seminary help someone to develop these skills of historical consciousness, these gems like what you've been sharing with us today?
Yeah, and I think what's amazing about the seminary is that you do get all the sort of the traditional courses that you might expect at a seminary of theology. You get really depth in that as well. There's also a real important historical requirement. So you're also going to get grounded in some of the issues I'm raising and other aspects of Christian traditions, such a range of traditions. There's all the world religions are represented, or as much as they can be. And so you really get both a kind of depth of theological education. You get exposure to a range of wide of world religions, because if you're going in the world and be a person of the world today, you really need to be aware of people from different backgrounds and cultures, and how do you speak to people in different, they have needs and you want to be compassionate towards them. And so you really need that. You need to have the theological piece, the range of understanding of a range of traditions. And I think it's, as you mentioned, really important to have that historical depth as well. So I think the seminary prepares people in a very unique way, really small classes, really close attention with your professors. And so I think there's a way that we care for people, the whole person, who you are as a person, what your particular interests are, not necessarily putting you in a particular box, but you tell us what you're interested in, how can we support you in that. And so I think there's a way that just from the start to the end, I feel like people are nurtured. The relationships that I've formed even already, excuse me, have been just amazing. And so I find there's just the holistic experience at the seminary. I think is just I've been really impressed with, and my conversation with students, they've really enjoyed it as well and gotten a lot out of it. So I think it's a wonderful place to study.
Brilliant. And can people study with you virtually as well as on site? Are there different options for studying with you in particular?
Yeah, so all my classes are online, and so I think, as I mentioned earlier, but I find it's so helpful because it opens up the number of people who can take the class. Because, as I said, you don't have to drive anywhere; just put on your computer, and technology has been so great. And so I found that to be wonderful because, again, for diversity and have access issues, I think it's just amazing because people of all ages, traditional ages, returning students, people who've never studied theology, people who have degrees in theology, can all come together and have these conversations. My classes are very discussion based, and so reading it, coming and talking to each other about those things. And so, yes, my classes are open, they're online, but also the seminary does offer in-person classes. Some classes are hybrid to kind of do that mix of both, and so you can get the in-person piece, but also online. And so my class in particular online, should probably plug them. So feel free to take a class with me. I'd love to have you.
Wonderful. And we're going to put all the specific ways that folks can connect with you and with San Francisco Theological Seminary virtually in the notes. Dr. Julius Bailey, thank you so much for your time today. This has been an eye-opening and enlightening conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I so enjoyed it.